Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For people who don't know me, I'm Peter Joyce. I'm the University of Otago Christchurch. And every year we host a series of public lectures. And tonight is the first of 8 that will be delivered at this lecture theatre over the next 8 weeks. And you're all very welcome to attend. The first 2 public lectures this year are being given by visitors to Christchurch. And tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jonathan Davidson, who's going to talk about resilience in everyday life. Dr. Davidson's here courtesy of the Margaret Black Trust, who had funded his visit to Christchurch. He was a keynote speaker in a disasters conference at the end of last week, been giving other addresses in the last few days, and I think he's got another talk to do after this evening before he returns to America. He trained in medicine in England, but then went to Scotland and trained in psychiatry, but he spent most of his career in North America and most of the last few decades at Duke University in North Carolina. Now, he initially got into this field of work because he was involved in examining veterans who had come back from one war or another with post-traumatic stress disorder, and that led to a wider range of questions. Why do some people develop post-traumatic stress disorder and others do not? So tonight we're looking at the positive side, what makes people resilient in everyday life, and it's my great pleasure to ask Dr. Davidson to come and give us an address. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for coming out at the end of a day's work to join me tonight in this presentation. My thanks also to the Black Family Trust for graciously bringing me over here. As Peter said, I kind of got into resilience through working with people that have post-traumatic stress disorder and looking to see what kinds of new treatments might be helpful for such individuals. And for the last 15 years, I'd say, resilience became quite an important subject in my own career. Tonight, I would like to try to cover some of the things that characterize people who are resilient and some of the benefits or the drawbacks that are associated with having resilience or not having resilience. And then for a lot of the talk, I thought the best way to convey the important points about resilience was actually to describe individuals, well-known people in history, to kind of dissect them and analyze from a psychiatric point of view or a resilience point of view what it was about them that we can learn in terms of resiliency. So with that, this is actually the simple part of the talk, to define resilience. Resilience comes from the word salire, to spring back, to leap, and obviously resilience is bouncing back after something has put you down, an adverse circumstance, some kind of stress, a setback. So the only way you can really test a person's resilience is in the context of adversity. Resilience indeed is present in everybody. I think that's an important point to make. It's not like some people are completely resilient and other people don't have any resilience. Everybody has some. And one way to illustrate this is if you take a major community disaster, like an earthquake or a flood, or people who go into combat, or even people who have individual traumas, only 10 to 15% will develop post-traumatic stress disorder. The modal human response to stress is to somehow or other deal with it successfully and get on with life. So that is essentially resilience. And it has been described by one of the resilience researchers as ordinary magic. That's a way to sort of describe resilience. It's ordinary because everybody has it, and it's something that you see every day in action. But there's a magical quality because it can really be a kind of a successful way to transform somebody's life. After Katrina, the hurricane that hit New Orleans. Up to 80% of the community reported that the experience left them with a feeling of deeper purpose, a better ability to cope with stress, and greater faith in their ability to rebuild life. So you sometimes hear the term post-traumatic growth, and in a sense this might be an illustration that as a result of what people have gone through, they somehow or other identify aspects of themselves which they feel have left them stronger or empowered in some way. If we were trees, a good tree to be would be the willow tree, because this is a resilient tree. And it's interesting that the word to describe the willow tree is Salix. I'm not an expert in the origins of language, but Salix sounds to me very much like Salieri. So maybe there's a sense that this is a resilient tree, and that's why it's so called. Just to digress a little bit, you may know that one of the medicines that comes from the willow tree is aspirin, salicylic acid. Well, there's no more versatile or resilient medicine in our armamentarium than aspirin. It's been around for 150 years. It has several different uses. Let's just consider for a minute characteristics of resilient people. And essentially, you can think of it as characteristics within the person, and also because resiliency cannot be really thought of in the absence of the environment we live in, then there's also the issue of connectedness to other people. So within the person, it's helpful to be of an optimistic disposition, to have a tendency to experience positive feelings and to think positive thoughts. And so you see optimism, faith that things will turn out better, even in bad times, or even if you don't understand things, that eventually it'll all become clear. The ability to experience humor, especially in adverse circumstances, to be enthusiastic and to hold a level of curiosity about the world within which we live, taking advantage of chances to learn new things. A strong sense of self, strong belief in oneself and one's capabilities, and resourcefulness. Flexibility, the tendency to bounce back, but also a toughness, hardiness. When you break down the concept of hardiness, you're really talking about commitment to something, the willingness to embrace challenge, and the ability to feel a certain sense of control. The locus of control is within you. There are actually scales or instruments that measure hardiness. That was one of the scales that we used to use a lot in our work. And then many times resilient people have a fairly clear sense of right and wrong, good and bad, and adhere to important guiding principles in their life. So what about with respect to the environment? The three things that count here is the ability to have, to receive, and to give. Social support is actually really important, and is one of the biggest protective factors that prevents you from getting post-traumatic stress disorder after trauma. Connectedness, and also to be able to engage in altruistic actions will be to the benefit of other people without you necessarily expecting to benefit yourself. So there are a lot of ingredients in a sense. It's simple to define resilience, but when you think about what goes into it, there's a lot that goes into it. I'm going to spend the next few minutes just to summarize the relationship between resilience and good health, like about 4 or 5 different illustrations. So we're not just talking about an abstract notion, we're talking about something that indeed may be associated with good or not so good health. Here's a study, it's called the NHANES, the National Health and Nurses Study, I think in the US, which is a large population cohort of several thousand people. And they have been followed for a long time. In this particular case, it was at the end of 15 years that the investigators reported a relationship between what they call emotional vitality. Emotional vitality is, if you like, part of what goes into being resilient. You can see the definition as they defined it: positive energy, the ability to regulate emotion and behavior, and being engaged and interested in life. People that had emotional vitality, and this was measured at the baseline in the study, were then followed up, and here the relationship was examined between being full of emotional vitality and whether or not you develop coronary heart disease. And there was a definite protective influence among those with high emotional vitality against developing coronary heart disease. And the relative risk, you see it says 0.81. What that means is there's a 20% lower chance of developing coronary heart disease if you have emotional vitality versus the chance if you have less emotional vitality. And as far as the investigators were concerned, they felt that this was something that was not related to being depressed or not being depressed. It stood on its own, but there was this protective effect of emotional vitality. And they thought that one of the things that it would lead to was a general awareness of health behaviors, and an empowered attitude by the individual to lead a lifestyle that was kind of pro-health. So here's another study, the protective effect of resilience in patients who actually have heart attacks, acute coronary syndromes. And the result of this study was that the severity of damage to the heart muscle was directly related to the amount, well, inversely related to the amount of resilience. So the more you were resilient, the less damage had actually occurred to the myocardium. Among diabetics, here's an investigator in Texas, Dr. Steinhardt, who developed a 4 sessions package of resiliency training and stress management and disease management for diabetic patients. And she found that the result of taking part in these sessions led to reduced body mass index, better control of blood sugar, and also positive changes in cholesterol and blood pressure. So again, in this case, cultivating resiliency by going into the course that she offered seemed to lead to better control of diabetes. Among HIV-positive women, this study by Dale showed that every increase by 1 point on the resilience scale was associated with a 15% increased likelihood of being adherent to antiviral medication. So more resilient people were just generally more engaged in participating in their treatment. Less resilient people would be unpredictable. They would not take their medicines regularly. Well, if you have HIV positive, that's very critical determinant of outcome. And Dale concluded that interventions that improve coping strategies that promote resilience in HIV-positive women may achieve higher antiviral therapy levels and also greater suppression of viral counts, which you see here. A large study in a US community in San Diego of 1,000 or so elders from the age of 50 upwards looked at the question of what does it take to age successfully. And this study by Dylan Jesty, who's one of the great geropsychiatrists in the US, found that there were 4 predictors of successful aging in the community. One was resilience. You see this here. The estimate, so-called, is a sort of like the size of the influence on predicting successful aging. So resilience, level of depression in the opposite direction, obviously. The more depressed you are, the less successfully you age. Physical functioning on a scale called the SF-36. So people who were in good physical health and functional were more likely to be successful agers. And then age itself. So these 4 variables, and they concluded that, I can read this, Resilience and depression had significant associations with self-rated successful aging, with effects comparable in size to that of physical health. So resilience clearly is something that we can relate to health and health status or management of chronic diseases. How can we increase resilience? Is it changeable, and how can we change it? So here's Peanuts, got some answers for us. Lucy's in the consulting office here, and she's offering psychiatric help for just 5 cents. It's a pretty good bargain. But competition arrives, and Snoopy decides to put up his stand right next door, and offers what's called friendly advice instead of psychiatric help. Friendly advice is only 2 cents. So the question is, of all the things that are being offered to help build resilience, is it friendly advice? Is it the 2-cent stuff, or is it the 5-cent stuff? And for that matter, how do we actually judge whether these things are effective? Well, there are many ways to develop resilience. And one way of thinking about it is a bottom-up and a top-down approach. And by that I mean, top-down would be, you go to a professionally qualified therapist and you take part in whatever the therapy package is, cognitive behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, or you can name it. They all help in one way or another. Or if you're depressed and you put on an antidepressant drug, that too will build a person's resilience. So that would be the sort of the top-down. You go to somebody and you get guidance. The bottom-up is more, what can I do for myself? And how can I do it in a way that is manageable and not unreasonable. So one of them here is I've listed doing things, and I said this earlier already. Altruism, it helps. People have found that quite a lot when they look at the factors that predict successful coping with stress. 2, community work, which is in a way a form of altruism. 3, maintaining and building social support. So all of those things are helpful. Regular exercise is also important, not just because it's good for you, which it is, but it more than likely creates patterns within the human physiology, the autonomic nervous system in the brain, which results in greater resiliency. And then don't underestimate good sleep. If a person is chronically lacking in sleep, one of the consequences is that it's not quite so easy to regulate one's emotional tone. 3, simple brain exercises, and there could be anything from learning to write with your non-dominant hand to, as it was suggested in a book called Neurobics by Lawrence Katz, learn some basic Braille, go into the elevator instead of pressing the regular floor button, number 2 floor, use your fingers, close your eyes, use your fingers, and press it with using the Braille. So, you can come up with as much creativity as you really want here. But any simple brain exercises, any simple behaviors which involve the acquisition of new habits, new skills, putting pathways in the brain to work that we tend not to use very much, can be all helpful building blocks. They're not dramatic, but helpful building blocks. Mindfulness meditation. This was unheard of about 20 years ago. I remember when Kabat-Zinn first went on the grand rounds and he started to write about meditation, mindful meditation. Most people thought it was like nothing much, but it's turned into a big movement in psychology and psychiatry, and it has pretty clear clinical payoff. It helps a lot of things. Mindfulness meditation can be, again, something that a person might cultivate themselves, or they have a choice. They can go and seek out somebody who runs workshops or offers it in the context of various kinds of psychotherapeutic packages. So this is another way to build resilience. And I'm going to come back to mindfulness because there's a very fascinating set of findings that I'd like to explain. People in the workplace, whether in the military or in a hospital, medical center, you name it, have developed packages which often address the specific needs of their employment. So if you're in the military, in the US, there's a couple of things. One's called War Adventure Quest and one's called War Ops. The Mayo Clinic developed a program called Stress Management and Resilience Training, which they apply to their physicians and offer to other staff there as well. Outward Bound could be, it's not really an employment or workplace course, but it's kind of a coordinated package of activities that can help build resilience. Psychotherapy, I've mentioned, and then other kinds of interventions, some antidepressants can also. So there's a lot of ways that an individual person can build resilience, and a lot depends on where you come from. If you're suffering from major depression and you're in treatment, that's one avenue, but you're probably going to have different kinds of things offered. If you're not in treatment at all, you're functioning fairly well, but you want to work on stress management and resiliency, then there are some options there too. Temperament and resiliency, this is a factor. You see this photograph here, very nice picture of the island of Kauai. It's a lovely place, spectacular beauty. And you wonder if there are ever any problems on a place like Kauai. Well, unfortunately there have been. And Werner, psychologist, child psychologist, did a lot of fascinating work in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, following up, rather like has been done here in Dunedin and Christchurch, following up large cohorts of people for a long period of time. She took children who were mostly living in the plantations on the island and followed them up, and many of them suffered from abuse and poverty and parental alcoholism. And she found that the ones who did best, first off, had a certain temperament. As she described it, they had an easy temperament. They were kind of, not fractious, not problematic in their behaviors. And such people were able more easily to elicit caring responses from their environment. And when she looked to see what was it that helped people growing up in that environment to become resilient, she found one was having interests and hobbies that provided solace in hard times. So it's like having a place to go where there's a sort of haven of peace and creativity. Two is to, again, take on a socially desirable task, and three is having a supportive relationship. Mindfulness, just make a comment about this. Davidson, this is not me, it's Richard Davidson, who's a psychologist in Madison, Wisconsin, has done quite a lot of work with mindfulness meditation. And one of his early studies, he trained a group of middle management personnel, some place of employment in the town, and they went through a course of mindfulness. He did some EEG studies, electroencephalogram studies, before and after treatment. He found that the ones who had completed the course showed changes in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which generally are associated with a positive affect, positive emotional state. He also found that when these individuals were given influenza vaccine, their antibody response was much more robust. So it's as if the course of mindfulness meditation not only led to positive emotional states, but also helped basically strengthen the immune system. And as he put it in his paper, changes of this nature are associated with the ability to recover rapidly from stress. So that's one. There are other studies too showing similar things with mindfulness meditation. Well, getting back to peanuts, do these treatments actually work? Are they worth 5 cents? And here's a review of different resiliency training programs that appeared not long ago. It was published by the Mayo Clinic group, the same people that developed the SMART program. And what you see here, they came up with about 13 studies that they thought met their criteria. And what you see on the right here is basically the difference between the effect of resiliency training and going into a control group, which is either, in this case, nothing at all except a waiting list, or in some cases, they got some other form of psychotherapy, but not the kind which was focusing on resilience. So with the total of all these studies, they found out that, bottom here, if I can maneuver this, there we are. This is what you can look at. This black diamond here is to the right of the middle line. And this is telling us that in aggregate, all of these interventions are more successful at building resilience than being in the control group. So they do make a difference. What Lepin said, though, is that a lot of these studies were not very strong methodologically. So the confidence with which these conclusions were drawn are not strong. I mean, it's like, probably it helps, but there's a lot of work to be done still to really prove the point. It's interesting that they did develop what they call SMART, Stress Management and Resilience Training. It is a one-session module that lasts an hour and a half. And then, as part of it, which we can go to the next slide, I'm not sure if you can see this very easily, but part of it involves training in brief, structured relaxation, paced breathing, meditation, and participants were taught to practice deep diaphragmatic breathing, 5 breaths per minute for 5 to 15 minutes, once or twice a day. So they were given some homework, and throughout the course of however long it went on, they were expected to put this into practice. But the initial module lasted 90 minutes, so it's not very time intensive. And the result of the course of SMART shows, the print is very small, but if you look at the bottom here, you see a measure of resilience, the baseline, and then week 8. So it was an 8-week period. They were following people. There was an increase in resilience from 69 up to 79, which is quite a substantial increase, whereas in the control group, there was no change at all. Likewise, perceived stress was down after the course, anxiety levels, Smith anxiety scale, and then the overall quality of life also improved. So just this one session module of SMART for medical doctors in the Mayo Clinic had some fairly tangible payoff. And I think that as we consider professionals dealing, actually here these were traumatized professionals, they were just dealing with everyday stress. For professionals who are actually having to cope with serious, chronic, and major trauma, you've got to take care of yourself, and or your employers have an obligation to make services available if they want to retain their staff. So here's an example of how it can be done. This slide says, just because you feel you've recovered doesn't mean you actually have recovered. And this comes up back to the question of what do we really mean when we define resilience and we say, oh, somebody's improved and they're feeling better. You can certainly say, well, psychologically a person is feeling better and their symptoms have come down, but that doesn't mean that their bodies have recovered. And here's a quite an instructive set of results from a group of people who survived a terrorist attack in the Oklahoma City bombing that took place about 10 or 15 years ago. It was a federal building, and a couple of disgruntled individuals decided to blow it up, and they killed about 180 people. So it was a serious event, and Tucker's group followed up a cohort of survivors and also a control group in the population that were not in the building. And she's followed them for several years, and what she found is that even though the survivors of the attack, which is the red group here, survivors of terrorism, were 60 here, even though they were recovered psychologically, they didn't have PTSD anymore, their symptoms had gone down a whole lot. What she found was that when they were talking about the event, their physiological arousal was so much greater than in the controls. To begin with, they started out, before even facing or recalling the event, they started out with higher pulse rates, so it suggests that their cardiovascular system had been reset after the attacks and had not come back down to baseline. And then it increased even more as they were exposing themselves to the memories and recalling that day. So here you have a situation, when they recovered afterwards, they still hadn't come down to the same level that the controls had. So it does suggest that when we consider the long-term consequences of exposure to serious trauma, we've got to be aware of physical health as well as psychological health, particularly cardiovascular difficulties. Okay, I'm going to go into the profiles. I think I've left time to go through everybody here, but if we need to cut out one or two, then we can do that. As I noted earlier, the only way you can really evaluate resiliency is in the context of some challenge or some adversity. So here we have 8 or 9 individuals that I picked out from literature. After, as you can see, certain events in their life which gave them trauma and stress and challenge. And childhood neglect, polio, deafness, slavery, sinking of a boat, being in a concentration camp, being a target of an assassination attempt, and having to deal with paranoid schizophrenia. So here we go. What do they teach us? Well, this first person, everybody knows who he is, Winston Churchill. Great example of resilience. And if anybody's interested in it, Anthony Storr, a British psychiatrist, wrote a very insightful essay which he called Churchill's Black Dog. Well, what does the black dog represent? Churchill was vulnerable to depressive illness. I suspect you could probably come up with a clinical diagnosis, if you had all the information in front of you. But for him, depression was a real issue and got him down in black. He called it the black dog. So first lesson here is that while you can be a very resilient person, you can also be vulnerable to serious mental illness. It's not like if you have one, you can't have the other. Churchill, or what Anthony Storr noted, was that Churchill's courage was not rooted in his genetics. So it's clear that genetics have some role to play in determining levels of resiliency, but it's not the whole story by any means. And according to Storr, Churchill was basically a person who dedicated his whole personal agenda to find ways to build up his courage and his determination. It was an act of will. And he even uses the term resilience in his essay, yet Churchill's dogged determination, his resilience and his courage enabled him until old age to conquer his own inner enemy. So there's this theme, if you look at all these people, there's this theme of doing battle within yourself. All these battles are personal, of course, but it involves having to overcome some kind of inner demon. Interestingly, when Churchill became very old, his brain started to not function well. He had strokes, he was a heavy drinker, he probably had chronic depression and maybe even possibly some elements of dementia. And with all of that going on, it just really eroded away his resilience. And that's what Storr is saying, that until his old age, he was able to conquer his inner enemy. Some of Churchill's saying, which I think tell us about what resilience is. Success is the ability to go from one failure to another. No lack of enthusiasm. Never give in, except to convictions of honesty and good sense. And this is the mantra, of course, for every therapist in the setting of prolonged exposure in cognitive therapy for phobic disorders. Never turn your back on the threatened danger and run away from it. If you meet it promptly without flinching, you will reduce the danger by half. So Churchill discovered that his own way. Now the second case here is his contemporary and colleague and friend, Franklin Roosevelt. We tend to think more of Franklin Roosevelt as the only president who ever was elected into 4 terms of office in the US, and for his amazing leadership during the era of the Depression and then into World War II. But there's another side of his life having to do with the polio that he contracted when he was in his 30s. And John Gunther described him as a man with great capacity to withstand shocks. Withstand shocks. Made him seem like he was made of rubber, which is kind of that quality of bouncing back. And his wife said the thing that took the greatest courage in his life, and she uses the word courage too, was his mastery of and his meeting with polio. And what this led to was, again, a great illustration of post-traumatic growth. According to Eleanor Roosevelt, Roosevelt's nature underwent a kind of plowing up. He became warm-hearted, humble in spirit, and people became his vital links of life. And if you look at his biography, that is indeed the case. Particularly with respect to polio, he would do whatever he could to make it possible for other polio sufferers to join him in the swimming baths and the spas and stuff. And then later on, 1938, he created the March of Dimes campaign as a systematic means to generate funding that could support research into causes and the treatment of polio. And while we know that the outcome of that was good, and the March of Dimes today, it still exists, but obviously its goals are very different. But all of this you can attribute pretty much to Roosevelt's dedication to be of service to other people from his own experience of polio. Can you imagine the age of 30, 35, or whatever he was, on the fast track politically, a very encouraging, bright agenda lay ahead of him, and then all of a sudden he's unable to walk. So the dime, the 10-cent coin, eventually recognized his efforts and his impact in this particular area, and his profile is now to be always seen on the back of the coin. The March of Dimes, as I said, continues apace, and it mainly is devoted to looking for ways to better the health of women in pregnancy and childhood health problems. Beethoven, number 3, going back a little bit in the history, but Beethoven was confronted again in his 30s with the inevitability of increasing deafness. And can you imagine if you're a musician and a performer going deaf? It's the last possible thing that you would want. And he had to come to terms with this, and he wrote what's been called the Heiligenstadt Testament. Heiligenstadt is a suburb of Vienna, which is where he was at the time. And in this testament, he basically writes honestly about where he's at in life, and he was at a terrible place. He felt isolated, angry, he was humiliated, and thought seriously of suicide. But one thing held him back. It seemed impossible to leave the world before I had brought forth all that I felt destined to bring forth. And so I muddled along with this wretched life. So there was one cause in his life, a greater cause. And he felt like a sense of destiny. Here I am, I've got this mission. And that's what kind of saw him through. And the bottom part here of the slide, central to his existence, was the longing to help mankind, raise itself from ignorance and pain. So again, this desire to be of help and good to the world, to other people. This was from a book by Salix, who wrote The Ninth, which is about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And it's interesting because after he'd gone through this crisis, this big time stress, if you like, his music took on a whole new character, and as Sachs put it, altered the course of Western music. Frederick Douglass is the next person. I'm not sure how well known he is to this community, but Frederick Douglass was a leader in abolition of slavery in the US. And he was born into slavery, as was often the case. He was taken away, his mother was removed when he was a young infant, and he was brought up by his grandmother until he was 7. At that point he was taken away from his grandmother by his owner. He taught himself to read at the age of 12. Enslaved people were not allowed to read. The whole fear of the white plantation society was that by empowering themselves with knowledge, they would become a serious threat. And so therefore, any efforts for enslaved people to read were squelched. Somehow he managed to do it. And at the age of 13, he was leading Bible meetings. Can you imagine the sort of precocity of such a person at that age being able to do that? And he knew that knowledge is the pathway from slavery to freedom. So education, knowledge, curiosity. Learn as much new information as you can. He was beaten by his owner at the age of 15, but he fought back, he wasn't taking it, and then the beatings ended. And then at the age of 19, he escaped. And the rest of his life story we know well. What became of him? He became a leader, an abolitionist, social reformer. He was an amazing orator, and he wrote his autobiography at the age of 27. And you have to wonder if writing your own biography or writing autobiographically might be another way to help in creating resiliency. Anyway, he, in his autobiography, there are two things I want to just mention. One is he refers to his natural elasticity. What this is saying is resilience isn't just some new concept that we've suddenly discovered for the first time. He knew all about resiliency too, he just didn't call it that. But elasticity, that's what it is. And then, again, getting back to the issue of the moral compass and the sense of right and wrong, he said here, I would unite with anyone to do right and with no one to do wrong. We'll move on to Margaret Mackworth, Viscountess Rhondda, who was the daughter of a Liberal Member of Parliament. She was on the Lusitania and was one of the survivors, and as a result of what happened, she felt her life had been saved in order to give additional purpose and direction. And she became a leader for women's rights and suffrage, and it was largely due to her efforts that eventually women were accepted into the House of Lords. She, after the Lusitania experience, suffered recurring bad dreams, so she obviously had some post-traumatic stress. But at the same time, the realization that she had found the strength to survive gave her a new self-confidence. And interestingly, and this is probably without any kind of professional treatment, she lost her fear both of water and of death. Henry Crystal, psychoanalyst, psychiatrist, who recently passed away, he was born in Eastern Europe, and as a result of the Holocaust, lost all of his immediate family. He was taken away and moved from one concentration camp to another. He actually spent more than 3 years in concentration camps performing slave labor. And right at the end of the war, just prior to liberation, at which time, fortunately, he was able to escape from a convoy and was found by the Allied troops. But at that time, he came pretty close to dying. And he said to himself, if I had to die, nobody would know and nobody would miss me. He eventually he was able to get into medical school in Germany, and then later on he came over to the United States. Discovered he had a distant aunt who lived in Detroit, made contact with her and came over, and that's where he settled. And he became a leading figure in describing and treating post-traumatic stress, especially related to concentration camp experiences. And he, a couple of quotes from Henry Crystal, which I think are worth taking away. I feel that healthy infantile omnipotence is the most important asset in dealing with life's stresses and traumas, by which I guess I understand that term to mean like a sense that you can do anything. There's nothing that I can't do, but with a realization that, in reality, of course you can't do everything, but you've got to believe you have this omnipotence at some level. And what would be your message to future generations? He says the greatest power is love. It gives us resilience, the power to survive and eventually forgive. And talking of forgiveness, I'll just spend 60 seconds on some data from a study we did in the US, looking at the general population, especially focusing on people in the community who've been exposed to malicious trauma at the hands of somebody else, either violence, sexual abuse, or some other damaging act. And we asked them, amongst other questions, did they forgive or not forgive the person who perpetrated the trauma? And we found that the ones who were forgivers ended up with higher scores of resilience. So they seem to be more resilient. And kind of fits in with what Henry Crystal just said. And it also fits in with what the science is starting to tell us. If you want to really understand forgiveness from a neurobiological, within a neurobiological framework, there are certain pathways in the brain, which I'll just try to highlight, having to do with one's neurologically represented sense of self, who you are, and your ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, empathize. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is where one is concerned more to deal with regulations of thoughts and emotions. So these three areas, I can't really get the mouse to 1, 2, and 3. So triangular areas. That's where, as far as we can see, forgiveness seems to be represented in the brain. And what's interesting is research has already found that people that forgive tend to live longer lives. Their well-being is generally better. They have lower rates of cardiovascular disease. And they also do not ruminate as well. In a sense, that's what forgiveness is. It's quitting ruminating. Ruminating is not a good thing, and it's one of the factors, if you are depressed, that prevents you from making a full recovery from depression. Am I doing all right on time, Peter?
Yep. 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll give myself another 5 minutes or so. Viktor Frankl, a name that probably many of you recognize. He also was a psychiatrist, and he also was a concentration camp survivor. He was a bit older when he was taken into a concentration camp. By that time, he was already a medically qualified doctor. And amazingly, in the camps that he was at, he conducted like counseling sessions on grief and loss. I think his experiences there were very important in the way he formulated his therapeutic approach. And he came to the conclusion early on that perhaps the biggest need for human beings is to find meaning and purpose in life. It's not the pleasure principle of Freud or the power principle of Adler, but it's the search for meaning. And he developed a form of therapy called logotherapy. There's a lot in logotherapy that is similar to modern techniques of positive psychology or well-being therapy. And here are a couple of notice he lived a pretty long life. Several of these individuals I picked out lived into their 80s and their 90s. Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose. He also actually took a quotation from Nietzsche, put it in his book, "Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how." Jung has said the same thing too. If something makes sense, you can put up with a lot. There's a reason for it. And then he says, "Forces beyond your control can take away everything." And he would know, being in a concentration camp, except your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation. That cannot be taken away. Malala. Malala's a great example of resilience. She, again, unlike Frederick Douglass, showed incredible precocity, and by the age of 11, she was already starting to speak out on behalf of the need to educate women in our country. And for that, the Taliban didn't like her, and they tried to assassinate her. They boarded a bus that she was on, and they asked, "Where's Malala?" And she put her hand up. And obviously she was shot, and fortunately she survived. And at the age of 17, she earned herself a Nobel Peace Prize. She has said of her own experiences here, "Nothing changed in my life except weakness, fear, and hopelessness died. Strength, fervor, and courage were born. And if we want to achieve our goal, then let us empower ourselves with the weapon of knowledge." Reminds me here of Frederick Douglass again. And she's a person who has not been deterred by setbacks. A strong sense of purpose has led to further growth, by her own words. Passionate commitment and holding fast to a moral compass. The last person, probably unheard of here, Ralph Albert Blakelock. He was an American landscape painter. And I got interested in him in a somewhat indirect way and ended up writing this paper. Ralph, I'll try to read this abstract because it kind of captures why I decided to include it. Ralph Blakelock was a leading American landscape painter. Much of his life was lived in obscurity and destitution. He developed late onset, that's in his 40s, paranoid schizophrenia, resulting in prolonged hospitalization, like 20 years in an asylum. During the time in hospital, demand for his artistic works grew, but he was unable to enjoy any of the success. Instead, the artist fell prey to unscrupulous exploitation by his self-appointed guardian, who basically wanted to make money out of him, and she was aided and abetted by his psychiatrists. And it is more than likely that this turn of events broke his spirit and hastened his demise. He died at the age of 72, having spent the last 20 plus years in a psychiatric asylum, isolated from the rest of the world. And here's Blake Locke. His paintings are beautiful. There's an exhibition about to open in New York later this year, and the person who's putting it on says, there's so much I want to share with you about Blake Locke, about the sheer force of imagination and determination, that he set a course that forever changed American art. And he contended with constant rejection and criticism. He was a rather naive, trusting person, and unfortunately, that's, I think, why he was taken advantage of. And he never recovered from his insanity. He painted beautiful moonscapes. And in the hospital, he kept telling his doctors and his staff that he was an artist, and people were, falling on backwards to buy his work because he was learning about it. And they didn't believe him. They said it was all delusional. It was part of schizophrenia. Terrible. Finally, the head of the hospital realized that this was true, and he started to create this pact with the woman who was out to exploit him. That's how that all happened. But in the hospital, he couldn't get hold of any equipment to paint, any materials to paint. So he ended up painting on the back of shirts, cigar boxes, pieces of paper, and he would make the brushes out of his hair. If he wanted to get hold of paint, the best he could come up with was a bit of ink with some tobacco juice. What adversity for somebody who turned out to be one of the greatest artists in his generation. And throughout all of that, he never lost his enthusiasm for nature and for painting. And in the hospital, this is actually his last work. This is his doctor doing rounds. Those days he rode a horse, I guess, when he moved around the hospital. And the house in the background was the doctor's house, where he was sometimes asked to go and play the piano to entertain guests. He was a really talented pianist. So that's the story of Blake Locke, and I think, again, illustrates resilience. These, I won't say all this, you can see it, you can read it. This is kind of summarizing what all of these individuals certainly have taught me about resilience. Just on a personal note to finish up, like everybody else in this room, I was awakened the other night, 3:30 in the morning. Frankly, since I'm here on a short visit, I wasn't expecting to actually experience it firsthand of an earth tremor or an earthquake. And I was glad that nothing further happened. I felt a bit scared for a while, especially when you're half awake, And then I thought, well, I'm going to go home and everything will be fine. But then I thought a bit more about it, and I realized that, well, I can't take it for granted that everything will be fine where I live either. And if you look at this map, in the US, everybody thinks that earthquakes happen on the west coast and hurricanes happen here on the east coast, which they do by and large. And then typhoons, tornadoes and floods happen where all the rivers are in the Midwest and so forth. Well, guess what? Charleston, which is my home, down here on the southeast coast of South Carolina, was visited by a devastating earthquake in 1886, just after it had begun to recover from the devastation of the Civil War, only 20 years later. And this was a serious earthquake. It was considered to be about 7 on the Richter scale and 10 on the measurement of earthquake intensity. And there was a lot of damage. And it's not on a tectonic plate problem, it's within a plate. That's the issue. Nobody quite knows the behavior. Very difficult to forecast those kind of earthquakes. There was a lot of liquefaction because there's a lot of sand and sludge and stuff. So the damage was considerable, and this was the Cleveland newspaper reporting on terror, takes complete possession of the inhabitants of Dunes, Charleston. This was one of many pictures taken at the time of the damage. It's considerable. And if you were to go to Charleston now, besides the fact that it has some beautiful old homes, the ones that survived, date back to the 1760s, and there's block after block of them, you notice these little round structures in the house. Here, for example, these were earthquake bolts put in after the earthquake to strengthen the buildings, so they would go all the way across from the front through to the back to basically tie the house together. Whether they would do any good, I don't know, but there haven't been any other earthquakes. But We're still getting earth tremors, that much I do know. It's of some reassurance to me, I guess, to know when I go back home that our mayor recently put together a plan, basically to tax property owners to raise some money in order to upgrade not only hurricane protection, because that's the real concern we have, but also, I'm glad to see, to protect against earthquake damage. And only 2 or 3 years ago, they in fact tore down 4 schools, elementary schools, that were not built up to code, and replaced them with buildings which are now considered to be up to earthquake code. So this fire engine house, this firehouse was built 1 year after that earthquake in 1886. So it's old, it is still in use, as you can see. It's just that they don't have horse-drawn wagons coming out, they have real fire engines. And it's the oldest station in the city, so they're trying to figure out how to strengthen all of those buildings too. So it's reassuring, right? Going back to a city that is supposedly prepared. That's what we're assured by the authorities anyway. So with that, I will end, and I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions and comments.
We always aim to finish at 8 so that people get away, but there's time for comments or questions for Dr. Davidson. Yeah.
In terms of trauma, is there any studies being done on parents whose children have died in resilience?
Parents whose children have died,
Yes.
under any particular circumstances, or I'm trying to think. In terms of resilience, there are a lot of studies going on. I haven't really seen results on them yet, but there are a lot of studies going on for children who have what are illnesses that are likely to lead to death, terminal illnesses or chronic illnesses from which they won't recover. There's quite a lot of activity there, but I haven't seen any results.
You might be interested in being told about probably our best novelist, Janet Frame, who very nearly had a frontal lobotomy inflicted on her by some medical people.
What happened there?
She continued writing. And one psychiatrist stopped her and said, no.
Oh, this was
She was in a mental hospital.
Okay, yeah. Well, there was a time when people in mental hospitals were getting that generally the most inappropriate indications too, like schizophrenia, so that wasn't good. Well, I'm glad she was spared it.
Yeah.
Is it easy to teach young children about resilience? Give them positive things to do to encourage resilience?
Well, I think that one might be able to take home some of the lessons from the studies in Kauai with the children, although they were being studied as children and as they grew up. And there were certain things, certain activities that did seem to protect them from poor coping. Getting involved in socially meaningful activities being one, and having cultivation of a hobby or some kind of creative recreational activity. Both of those were helpful. Clearly, support figures, a caring mentor, for example, would also be an important asset. Yes?
You didn't mention it, but I wondered about the role of an animal, a pet.
Good point, very good point. And yes, you're absolutely right. They're of great value. Pet therapy is being incorporated in a number of different contexts. Certainly, Veterans Administration that I'm familiar with in the U.S. They're very well received, and I was on a committee last few years where we visit various VA centers to find out what they were doing, and that was one of the activities that constantly was greatly appreciated by both the staff and by the patients. Pet therapy has a role. I mean, in that instance, it's more to help people recover from conditions like post-traumatic stress, but no reason why it couldn't be helpful also for creating some of the things that lead to greater resiliency, caring, bonding, for example.
I think we're at 8 o'clock, or maybe one last question.
I think, like Cameron, I'm an engineer involved in the rebuild. A personal opinion, please. Do you think that knowledge of the hazard, knowledge of the risk, will improve resilience?
Knowledge of the risk, you mean by the general public or by the
By an individual to know more about the threat of, for instance, earthquake?
I'm a great believer in information, and I think that as a consumer myself, if you like, or a member of the public, that it's very helpful to know what status of a particular building is if you can be reassured that reasonable precautions are taken to prevent risks. For example, I think that's very useful to know. I don't know if there's any benefit to hide it.
Okay, well, it's now 8 o'clock. We like to finish on time and start on time, so I'll ask you to thank Dr. Davidson.